Lieutenant Keth Voren stood at the observation deck of the Celestial Accord and watched the stars drift by like cold diamonds scattered across black velvet, and he felt nothing but the familiar comfort of routine that had defined his entire military career. He was Valorian, a member of a species that had mastered the art of survival through calculation and careful planning, and in his 40 years of service he had never once acted without knowing the exact probability of success. His forearms rested behind his back in the traditional posture of contemplation, and his silver eyes reflected the starlight as he reviewed the upcoming mission in his mind. 7 campaigns he had survived, 3 major fleet engagements he had walked away from without a single scar, and countless commendations he had earned for what his superiors called tactical excellence. But Keth Voren knew the truth about himself and his people. They did not win battles through bravery or bold action. They won by never taking risks that could not be calculated down to the smallest decimal point. Victory in Valorian doctrine meant 0 casualties, and battle was nothing more than mathematics applied to violence, a cold equation where every variable was controlled and every outcome was predicted. Before the first shot was fired, he had lived to 100 years by following this simple rule, and he had every intention of living to 100 more. The door behind him hissed open, and his second officer entered with a data tablet clutched in her trembling hands. And Keth Voren knew immediately that something had changed. "Lieutenant," she said with obvious nervousness in her voice, "the Coalition has assigned a joint species unit to our extraction mission, and they are boarding within the hour." Keth Voren turned slowly and took the tablet from her hands, and what he read made his twin hearts skip in their synchronized rhythm. Humans, he had heard stories about this newly integrated species, whispered tales that spread through the Coalition like a strange disease, and none of what he heard made any logical sense. They lived barely a century, sometimes less, and yet they threw themselves into danger as if death was merely an inconvenience. Rather than the ultimate failure, they were emotional and loud and unpredictable, and every tactical analysis of their behavior patterns came back with the same confused conclusion. They did not follow any rational model of self-preservation. Keth Voren had dismissed these stories as exaggeration, the kind of tall tales that species told about newcomers to make themselves feel superior. But now he would see the truth for himself. "Prepare the docking bay," he said without emotion, "and inform the crew to observe standard protocols when interacting with our new allies." 1 hour later, he stood in the docking bay as the human shuttle attached to the Celestial Accord, and the hiss of pressurization filled the air with anticipation. The doors opened, and they walked out, and Keth Voren felt his analytical mind immediately begin cataloging everything wrong. With what he saw, there were 12 of them, all wearing heavy combat armor that seemed crude compared to Valorian design, and they moved with a chaotic energy that made his skin crawl. They laughed and joked with each other, as if they were heading to a celebration rather than a combat mission, and their leader walked at the front with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She was smaller than Keth Voren expected, the Sergeant Maya Chen, with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that seemed to hold fire behind them. "Lieutenant Keth Voren," she said as she extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. "Heard a lot about you Valorians. They say you never lose a soldier in combat." Keth Voren accepted the handshake with one of his forearms and found her grip surprisingly strong for such a small creature. "That is correct," he replied, "and we achieve this through careful planning and calculated risk assessment. I trust your people will follow our tactical guidelines during the mission." Maya exchanged a look with her squad that Keth Voren could not interpret, and several of the humans made sounds that he recognized as suppressed laughter. "We will certainly try our best," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "But I should warn you, Lieutenant, my people have a different relationship with risk than yours do." The mission briefing took place 1 hour later in the tactical center, and Keth Voren watched the holographic display with growing unease as the situation became clear. Coalition diplomats were trapped on a research station that had been overrun by the Vreth swarm, a hive-mind enemy species that attacked in overwhelming numbers and showed no mercy to their victims. The Vreth were nightmares given physical form, insectoid creatures that communicated through pheromones and acted as one terrible organism spread across thousands of bodies. Keth Voren had fought them twice before, and both times he had survived only by retreating when the odds turned against him, because that was what rational beings did when faced with certain death. Current sensor readings show approximately 3,000 Vreth biosignatures on the station, the tactical officer announced, and the 18 diplomats are barricaded in the central core with limited supplies. And failing life support, Kethvorin's mind immediately began calculating odds and forming contingency plans, and none of the numbers looked favorable if Vreth numbers exceed projected resistance capacity by more than 40%. Standard protocol requires mission abort and tactical withdrawal, he said to the assembled group, and these numbers clearly exceed that threshold. The room fell silent, and Kethvorin noticed that the humans were staring at him with expressions he could not read. Maya leaned forward in her chair, and her voice was calm but carried an edge of something dangerous. Beneath the surface, let me make sure I understand you correctly, Lieutenant. You are suggesting we leave 18 innocent people to die because the math does not work in our favor. I am suggesting we do not add our own deaths to theirs through foolish heroics. Kethvorin replied evenly. Because that is what logic demands. Maya stood up slowly and walked to the holographic display. And when she turned to face the room, her eyes had changed into something hard and unyielding. Here is what I know about logic, she said quietly. It keeps you alive, but it does not make you worth keeping alive. Those people in that station are counting on someone to come for them. And I did not join this military to run calculations while innocents die. The other humans nodded in agreement, and Kethvorin felt something strange stir in his chest that he could not identify. We are going in, Maya continued with absolute certainty in her voice. And you can come with us, or you can stay on the ship and watch. But either way, those diplomats are coming home. She smiled at him then, and there was no mockery in it, only a strange kind of invitation. Don't worry, Lieutenant. We will try not to make things too exciting. The other humans laughed at her words, and Kethvorin realized that he was seeing something he had never encountered before. In all of his 200 years of careful living, he was seeing people who were not afraid to die, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. For hours later, the celestial accord dropped out of hyperspace, and the station hung before them in the darkness like a wounded animal waiting for death to claim it. The lights were failing, flickering in patterns that suggested massive internal damage, and the sensor readings showed Vreth biosignatures moving through every corridor and chamber. The mission parameters had already failed before they had even begun. And this was no longer an extraction, this was a siege. And somewhere in the back of his calculated mind, Kethvorin wondered if he would finally learn what it meant to face true danger. The boarding shuttle cut through the void between the celestial accord and the dying station, and Kethvorin gripped his precision rifle with 3 of his 4 hands, while the 4th checked his ammunition count for the 7th time. Around him sat his Valorian squad, 8 soldiers trained in the same doctrine of calculated survival that had kept their species alive for millennia, and their faces showed the calm focus of warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. Across from them sat the humans, and everything about them was wrong. They did not sit in orderly rows, but sprawled across their seats, like they were relaxing before a sporting event, and their conversations jumped from topic to topic, with no logical progression. One Marine named Torres was telling a story about something called a bar fight that apparently happened on shore leave, and the others laughed even though they were minutes away from entering a combat zone filled with thousands of hostile creatures. Kethvorin watched Maya check her weapon, a brutal-looking shotgun that seemed designed for close-quarters carnage rather than precise elimination, and he wondered again what madness had brought these creatures into space to minutes to breach. The pilot announced over the intercom, and the humans finally fell silent as they performed their final equipment checks. The shuttle connected to the station airlock with a heavy thud, and the doors opened to reveal a corridor bathed in emergency red lighting that flickered and died at random intervals. Kethvorin took point, and his squad fell into textbook formation behind him, overlapping fields of fire covering every angle of approach. While they advanced with methodical precision, the humans did not follow the formation. They spread out in a loose pattern that made no tactical sense, covering ground quickly but leaving gaps that any competent enemy could exploit. And Maya walked at the front as if she was taking a casual stroll through a garden. Sergeant Chen, Kethvorin hissed through the communication channel, "Your people are out of position. Please instruct them to maintain proper defensive spacing. This is our defensive spacing. She replied calmly, we move fast and we adapt faster. Trust me, Lieutenant. We know what we are doing. Before he could argue further, the Vreth attacked. They came from the ventilation shafts above like a waterfall of chitin and claws. Dozens of insectoid bodies dropping into the corridor with screeching war cries that echoed through the metal walls. Kethvorin's training activated immediately, and he shouted for his squad to fall back to a defensive choke point where they could control the engagement. His Valorians responded perfectly, retreating in coordinated steps while laying down, suppressing fire that dropped the front ranks of the swarm. But the humans did not retreat. Maya charged directly into the mass of creatures with her shotgun roaring, and the sound was like thunder in the enclosed space as Vreth bodies exploded around her. She moved through them like a force of nature, never stopping, never slowing, and wherever she turned another enemy fell to her weapon behind her. Torres had somehow acquired a welding torch from a maintenance panel and was using it to seal a ventilation shaft, cutting off reinforcements while screaming something in a language Kethvorin did not recognize. Another Marine named Okonkwo had pulled out a small device and was broadcasting signals that made half the Vreth suddenly turn on each other, tearing their own swarm apart in confused fratricide. What is she doing? Kethvorin whispered as he watched Maya pull a wounded Valorian soldier behind cover, exposing herself to enemy fire to save someone she had never met. His calculations told him that her actions had a 73% mortality probability, that no rational being would risk their life for a stranger, that everything she was doing violated every rule of survival he had ever learned. And yet she was winning. The Vreth fell back, their numbers thinned by the unexpected ferocity of the human counterattack, and for a moment the corridor was silent except for heavy breathing and the distant skittering of retreating claws. Maya walked back to Kethvorin, with Vreth blood dripping from her armor, and her smile was savage and alive in a way that made something deep inside him tremble. You okay, Lieutenant? She asked, as if she had not just charged alone into an enemy horde. You look a little shaken. You could have died, he said, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. The odds were against you. The odds are always against someone, she replied simply. We just make sure it is not the people we are trying to save. They pushed deeper into the station, and Kethvorin found himself watching the humans more than he watched for enemies. They did not fight like any species he had encountered in his long career. They improvised and adapted and created solutions from nothing, turning every obstacle into an opportunity. When a corridor was blocked by debris, Okonkwo rigged a maintenance drone to blast through the obstruction, while Torres covered him with steady fire when a pack of Vreth ambushed them from a side passage. Jackson, a massive human with a voice like grinding stone, simply picked up a piece of broken machinery and used it as a club, smashing through the creatures with raw strength while laughing like he was enjoying himself. They were chaos given form, and somehow that chaos was more effective than all of Kethvorin's careful planning. For hours into the mission, they reached the station core, and the tactical display showed exactly how desperate their situation had become. The diplomats were alive, barricaded in a reinforced chamber just 200 meters away, but between them and safety were more than 2,000 Vreth waiting in perfect formation. And at the center of that formation was something Kethvorin had hoped never to see again. A hive commander, a bloated mass of neural tissue that served as the central consciousness of the swarm, had arrived on the station and was now coordinating the Vreth with terrifying intelligence. The random attacks they had faced before were nothing compared to what was coming. A hive commander could direct thousands of bodies like fingers on a hand, predicting enemy movements and countering every tactical approach with perfect efficiency. That changes things, Torres said quietly as he studied the display. And for the first time, Kethvorin heard hesitation in a human voice. Maya stared at the display for a long moment, her face unreadable. And then she did something that made Kethvorin question everything. He thought he knew about the universe. She smiled. It was not a smile of denial or madness, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like anticipation. And when she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. 2,000 hostiles, one hive mind, 18 innocent lives, and a station falling apart around us, she said slowly. Now it is a real fight. The other humans actually cheered at her words. And Keth Voren felt his twin hearts racing in a rhythm he had never experienced before. He had spent 100 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation, and now he was trapped in it with a species that seemed to think impossible odds were an invitation, rather than a warning for the first time in his long and careful life. Keth Voren did not know what would happen next, and somewhere in the depths of his analytical mind, a small voice wondered if that uncertainty might be exactly what he needed. The makeshift command post was nothing more than a storage room reinforced with debris, but it had become their sanctuary in a station filled with nightmares, and the team gathered around a flickering holographic display that painted their faces in blue light. 2 Valorian soldiers were dead, their bodies left behind in carters now crawling with breath, and the weight of those losses hung over Keth Voren like a physical burden in his entire career. He had never lost a soldier under his command, and now 2 names would be added to the memorial walls of his home world, because he had followed humans into chaos, but it was Jackson who demanded his attention now, the massive human marine lying on an improvised stretcher with wounds that would have killed any Valorian twice over. A Vreth blade had pierced his chest during the last engagement, missing his heart by less than 2 centimeters, and yet he was still conscious, still speaking, still somehow making jokes. "Hey Torres," Jackson called out in a voice weakened by blood loss. "Remember that time on Kepler Station when you bet me I could not eat 15 protein bars in one sitting?" Torres laughed, even as he applied another layer of medical sealant to Jackson's wounds, and his hands were steady despite the impossibility of what he was attempting. "You threw up for 3 hours afterward," Torres replied, "and then you asked for dessert." "Good times," Jackson said with a smile that should not have been possible given his condition. "Good times." Keth Voren watched this exchange with a mixture of confusion and something he could not name, and when he ran the survival calculations on Jackson's injuries, the numbers came back at less than 8% the human was dying. They all knew it, and yet he spent his remaining time making his friends laugh. This was not rational. This was not logical. This was everything Keth Voren had been taught to avoid throughout his long life, and yet he could not look away. Maya stood apart from the group, studying the tactical display with an intensity that seemed to burn through the holographic projections, and Keth Voren approached her with questions he needed answered. "Sergeant Chen," he said quietly so the others would not hear, "I have calculated our survival probability at 12%, and standard protocol demands we retreat to the ship. While evacuation is still possible." Maya did not look at him when she replied, and her voice was calm but carried depths he could not fathom. "We are not leaving. Lieutenant, you will die here." Keth Voren pressed, "All of you. For 18 diplomats you have never met and will never know. How can that possibly make sense?" Finally she turned to face him, and her eyes held something that looked almost like pity mixed with understanding. "That is exactly the point," she said slowly. "We do not have to know them. We do not have to be their friends or family or even speak the same language. They needed help and we were able to give it, and that is enough." She gestured toward Jackson on his stretcher, toward Torres working frantically to keep his friend alive, toward Okonkwo triple-checking ammunition while muttering prayers in a language from old Earth. "Look at them, Lieutenant. Really look at them and tell me what you see." Keth Voren looked, and for a moment the analytical filters fell away from his perception, and he saw something he had never seen before. He saw people who knew they were probably going to die, and had made peace with that knowledge, not through resignation, but through purpose. They were not fighting because they expected to win. They were fighting because fighting was the right thing to do, and the outcome mattered less than the choice itself. "In Valorian culture," Keth Voren said slowly, "sacrifice is considered shameful, evidence of poor planning, because life is the only resource that cannot be recalculated or replaced in human culture." Maya replied, "Sacrifice is considered the highest honor, because nothing proves the value of something more than being willing to die for it." She reached out and placed her small hand on one of his forearms, and the gesture was strangely comforting. "Despite everything, we do not live as long as your people, Lieutenant. 100 years if we are lucky, often less, and that changes how we see the universe. We do not have time to play it safe, so we play it loud, and we make every moment count for something." Okonkwo approached them with a data tablet, showing updated sensor readings. and his face was grim as he displayed the information. I found the hive commander location. He said, "It is in the reactor deck, directly below us, and if we can destroy it, the swarm will lose coordination. Long enough for us to evacuate the diplomats. What is the catch?" Torres asked from across the room, and his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "The reactor deck is flooded with radiation and compromised by structural damage," Okonkwo explained. "Anyone who goes down there will be fighting through Vreth swarms while cooking from the inside out. The radiation shielding in our armor will give maybe 20 minutes of protection. Before organ failure begins." Silence fell over the room, and Keth Voren watched as every human present processed this information with the same calculating look he usually saw in Valorian tacticians. Then Maya stepped forward, and her voice was steady as stone. "I will go," she said simply. "I am the best shot and I know demolitions. Give me the charges and I will end this." "No," Torres said immediately, rising from Jackson's side. "I am going. You need to lead the evacuation." "Both of you shut up," Okonkwo interrupted. "I found the commander, so I should be the one to. I want to go too." Jackson called weakly from his stretcher, and despite everything he managed a bloody grin. "Someone carry me down there and point me at the bad guys." They were arguing over the right to walk into certain death, competing for the privilege of sacrifice, and Keth Voren felt something crack inside his chest that he had not known was there his whole life. He had run from danger, calculated every risk, preserved himself above all other considerations, and here were beings with a fraction of his lifespan fighting each other for the chance to throw that precious time away. Something changed in that moment. Something fundamental shifted in the core of who Keth Voren was, and when he spoke his own voice surprised him. "I will go with you." Every eye in the room turned to him, human and Valorian alike, and Maya's expression shifted from surprise to something like respect. "You do not have to do this, Lieutenant," she said carefully. "This is not in your protocol." Keth Voren felt strange, lighter somehow, as if chains he had never noticed were falling away from his soul. "No," he agreed. "But it is now." He looked at Jackson dying on the stretcher with a smile still on his face, at Torres whose hands had not stopped working to save his friend, at Okonkwo who had just volunteered to walk into radiation and monsters. Without a moment of hesitation, "I have lived to 100 years following protocol," Keth Voren continued, "and I have never done anything that mattered beyond my own survival. If I am going to die, I would rather die trying to save 18 strangers than live another 100 years. Knowing I ran away." Maya studied him for a long moment, and then she nodded once with something like a smile. "Welcome to humanity, Lieutenant," she said. "Now let us go kill a hive commander." The maintenance shaft leading to the reactor deck was barely wide enough for Keth Voren to squeeze through, and the metal walls groaned around them like a wounded animal as they descended into hell. Maya moved ahead of him with practiced grace, her smaller frame navigating the cramped space with ease while her shotgun remained ready for whatever waited below behind them. The sounds of battle echoed from the upper levels where Torres and the others held the line against probing Vreth attacks, buying time for the two-person team to reach their objective. "How are your radiation readings?" Maya asked without turning around, and her voice was casual despite the circumstances. Keth Voren checked the sensor built into his armor and felt his stomach clench at what he saw already at 15% of safe exposure. He replied, "We will reach critical levels within 18 minutes, then we better move fast," she said simply, and kicked open the hatch. At the bottom of the shaft, the reactor deck was a nightmare made real, a twisted landscape of broken machinery and flickering emergency lights. Where shadows moved with malicious intent, radiation warning symbols glowed red on every surface, and the air itself seemed thick with invisible poison that was already beginning to cook them from the inside and everywhere, covering every surface like a living carpet of horror. The Vreth waited. There were hundreds of them in this section alone, workers and warriors and strange biomechanical constructs that served purposes Keth Voren could not identify, and they all turned toward the intruders with synchronized hunger contact, Maya announced calmly. And then she was moving before Keth Voren could process what was happening. Her shotgun roared, and 3 Vreth exploded into fragments of chitin and ichor, and she was already advancing before the bodies hit the ground. Keth Voren raised his own weapon, a precision rifle that felt suddenly inadequate for this kind of warfare, and began picking off targets with the cold accuracy his training had instilled. But watching Maya fight was like watching a completely different kind of combat, something primal and fierce that had no place in his calculated understanding of warfare. She did not aim for optimal targets or conserve ammunition or maintain defensive positioning. She simply attacked with everything she had, trusting momentum and aggression to carry her through, and somehow it worked. They pushed forward through corridors that should have been impassable, stepping over Vreth corpses and dodging strikes from creatures that seemed as surprised by their audacity as Kethvorin felt. "You humans," he said between bursts of fire. "You fight like you have nothing to lose." Maya laughed, actually laughed, while reloading her weapon in the middle of a firefight. "We have everything to lose," she replied. "That is exactly why we fight this way. When the stakes are everything, holding back becomes the real danger." Of Vreth warrior lunged at Kethvorin from a side passage, and he reacted on instinct rather than calculation for the first time in his life. He dropped his rifle and caught the creature with two of his arms while the other two grabbed a piece of broken piping from the floor, and he drove the improvised weapon through the Vreth's skull with a strength he did not know he possessed. The creature collapsed, and Kethvorin stood over it breathing heavily, and he realized he was shaking, but not from fear. He was shaking from something that felt almost like exhilaration. "There it is," Maya said with approval in her voice. "There's that fire I knew you had somewhere inside." They found a moment of cover behind a collapsed support beam, and the brief pause allowed Kethvorin to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why do your people embrace death so easily?" he asked. "How can you throw yourselves into danger without calculating the cost?" Maya checked her ammunition running low. He noted, and her expression became thoughtful. "We do not embrace death," she said slowly. "We embrace life, and sometimes living fully means risking everything. Our ancestors climbed mountains and crossed oceans and explored the stars, not because they wanted to die, but because they refused to exist without meaning." She gestured at the chaos around them, at the monsters and the radiation and the near-certain death waiting ahead. "This is what being alive feels like, Lieutenant. Not the safe moments, not the calculated risks, but the times when everything is on the line and you choose to push forward anyway." "But the fear," Kethvorin pressed. "How do you function through the fear?" Maya smiled, and there was something ancient and knowing in her expression. "The fear never goes away. We just learn to carry it with us like a companion rather than a chain. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to act despite the fear." And every human learns that lesson. Eventually they moved again, fighting through another wave of Vreth, and Kethvorin found himself abandoning his rifle entirely in favor of a human shotgun scavenged from a fallen Marine's emergency cache. The weapon kicked like a living thing in his hands, brutal and loud and utterly lacking in precision. And he discovered that he loved it. He screamed as he fired, a sound he had never made in 100 years of careful living. And Maya laughed beside him with joy in her voice. "There it is," she shouted over the chaos. "There's that human spirit I was looking for. I am not human," he shouted back while blasting another Vreth into fragments. "No," she agreed. "But you are learning." They reached the Hive commander's chamber after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and Kethvorin's radiation counter showed they had perhaps 5 minutes before critical exposure. The chamber was massive, a converted reactor control room now dominated by the bloated mass of neural tissue that served as the swarm's central consciousness. The Hive commander pulsed with sickly bioluminescence, tendrils extending into the station's computer systems, and around it stood an elite guard of Vreth warriors, specifically evolved to counter exactly this kind of assault. "There it is," Maya said quietly. "Kill that thing and the swarm falls apart." "The guards," Kethvorin observed. "There are at least 40 of them. We cannot fight through that many." Maya did not answer immediately, and when he turned to look at her, he saw that she was wounded, badly wounded. A Vreth blade had caught her during their push through the corridors, and dark blood was soaking through her armor at an alarming rate. She had not said anything, had not slowed down, had simply kept fighting while bleeding out. "I will draw them off," she said calmly. "You plant the charges and detonate them. That is the mission. You will die," Kethvorin said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Probably," she agreed. "But those 18 diplomats will live, and so will Torres and Okonkwo and everyone on that ship. That is a trade I am willing to make." She pressed the detonator into his hands, her grip weaker than it should have been, and her eyes met his with absolute certainty. "I did not come here to live, Lieutenant. I came here to make sure everyone else does. Now go." Before he could argue, she was moving, charging toward the elite guard with her shotgun blazing and her voice raised in a human battle cry that echoed through the chamber. The Vreth turned toward her, all of them, drawn by her noise and movement and the sheer audacity of a single wounded creature, attacking 40 warriors, and Kethvorin ran. He ran toward the hive commander, with the detonator clutched in his hands, and behind him he heard Maya fighting alone against impossible odds. But even as he ran, even as he focused on the mission, he heard something that stopped his heart. She was singing. Her voice rose above the sounds of battle, a human war song in a language he did not understand, and there was no fear in it, no desperation. Only fierce joy and absolute defiance. She was dying, and she was singing. And Kethvorin had never heard anything so beautiful or so terrible in his entire long life. He reached the hive commander and began planting charges. And he did not look back, because looking back would mean watching her fall. And he could not bear to see that, but he listened to her song until the very last note. And when silence finally fell, something inside him broke and reformed into something new. The hive commander sensed Kethvorin's approach and turned its massive bulk toward him. And suddenly his mind was not his own. Visions flooded through his consciousness like poison. Images of futility and despair projected directly into his brain by the ancient intelligence that controlled the swarm. He saw himself dying alone in this chamber, saw the diplomats being torn apart, saw the celestial accord burning in the void while Vreth swarmed through its corridors. He saw the cold mathematics of his own death calculated with perfect precision. Every variable accounted for, every outcome predetermined. You cannot win. The hive commander whispered in frequencies that bypassed his ears entirely. You are one creature against thousands, one small life against the inevitability of the swarm, and your death has already been written. Kethvorin felt his hands trembling on the detonator, felt the familiar pull of calculation and probability dragging him toward surrender. The numbers did not lie. He was going to die here, and nothing he did would change that fundamental truth. But then he thought of Maya. He thought of her charging alone into 40 elite warriors, singing as she went, choosing to die so that others might live. He thought of Jackson joking on his deathbed, of Torres fighting to save his friend against impossible odds, of Okonkwo praying while loading his weapon. He thought of every human he had watched throw themselves into danger with joy rather than despair. And suddenly the mathematics did not matter anymore. You are right. He thought back at the hive commander. I am probably going to die here. He armed the charges with steady hands, but dying for something is better than living for nothing. And that is a lesson your kind will never understand. The hive commander screamed in frequencies that shattered glass and cracked metal. And for one terrible moment Kethvorin felt his consciousness begin to dissolve under the psychic assault. Then he pressed the detonator. The explosion was beautiful. Fire and force tore through the hive commander's bloated form, and across the entire station thousands of Vreth suddenly lost their coordinating intelligence. The swarm collapsed into chaos, individual creatures reverting to base instincts, attacking each other and fleeing into shadows and dying without purpose or direction. Kethvorin was thrown across the chamber by the blast, his armor cracked and his body broken. But somehow he was still alive. He pulled himself to his feet with arms that did not want to work, and he stumbled through smoke and debris toward where he had last seen Maya fall. He found her surrounded by Vreth corpses, so many corpses that she was nearly buried beneath them, and his heart stopped when he saw how still she lay. But then her eyes opened, and her voice was barely a whisper but unmistakably alive. Did you get it? She asked. Yes, he said, and the word came out broken with emotion. He did not know how to process. Good, she said, and then she smiled with blood on her teeth. Told you we would make it exciting. He picked her up in his forearms, her small human form lighter than he expected, and he began walking toward the exit. Vreth scattered before him, their coordination gone, and he walked through them like they were not even there. He walked through radiation that was killing him with every step, through corridors filled with fire and debris, through hell itself with Maya Chen in his arms, and he did not stop, did not calculate, did not think about the odds. He just walked, because that was what humans did. And somewhere along the way he had become something more than Valorian. The evacuation shuttle was waiting when he finally reached the docking bay. And Torres was there with medical supplies and tears streaming down his face. "She is alive," Keth Voren announced, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "She needs medical attention immediately." Torres took Maya from his arms and rushed her to the shuttle, and Okonkwo appeared beside Keth Voren with something like wonder in his expression. "You did it," Okonkwo said quietly. "You actually did it." "We did it," Keth Voren corrected. Together the shuttle lifted off as the station began its final collapse, and through the viewport Keth Voren watched the place where he had been reborn disappear into fire and debris. The diplomats were safe, all 18 of them, crowded into the shuttle with wide eyes and trembling hands. Jackson had survived barely and was making jokes about his scars while Torres tried unsuccessfully to make him rest. Maya was unconscious but stable, her vital signs holding steady under the medical computer's watchful care. And Keth Voren sat alone by the viewport, watching the stars drift by, feeling like a completely different person than the one who had started this mission. Torres sat down beside him after a while, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "She's going to make it," Torres finally said. "The doctors on the Celestial Accord say she will need months of recovery, but she is going to live." "Good," Keth Voren replied, and he meant it more than he had ever meant anything. "You know what she said?" When she woke up briefly, Torres asked with a small smile. "She said she was proud of you, that you finally learned what it means to be human." Keth Voren considered this for a long moment, watching the stars that had once seemed so cold and distant. "I am not human," he said carefully, "but I think I understand now why your species has spread so far across the galaxy, despite your short lives and your reckless ways." "Yeah," Torres asked. "Why is that?" "Because you do not count the cost before you act," Keth Voren replied slowly. "You simply see what needs to be done, and you do it, regardless of the consequences. And that kind of courage is contagious." Torres laughed softly and clapped Keth Voren on the shoulder. With easy familiarity, "Welcome to the club, Lieutenant." 3 weeks later, Keth Voren stood before the Valorian High Command, explaining his actions in clinical terms that failed to capture any of what had actually happened. They were disturbed by his conduct, these ancient leaders who had never risked anything in their long lives, and they recommended psychological evaluation and possible removal from command. Keth Voren listened to their concerns with patience. He did not feel, and when they finished speaking, he submitted his transfer request. He asked to be reassigned to the Human Expeditionary Force, to serve alongside the species that had taught him what it meant to truly live. The High Command thought he had lost his mind, and perhaps they were right, but when he visited Maya in the medical bay before departing, and she smiled at him from her recovery bed with approval in her eyes, he knew he had made the right choice. "Regret anything?" She asked. "Only that it took me 100 years to learn something your species seems to be born knowing," he replied. "And what is that?" He considered the question carefully, thinking about everything he had experienced, everything he had lost and gained, and become. "That survival is not the same as living," he finally said. "That true danger is not physical death but the death of meaning, and that the only way to become who you were meant to be is to risk everything for something greater than yourself." Maya's smile widened, and there was no mockery in it, only warm acceptance. "Welcome to humanity, Lieutenant," she said. "Even if you still have 4 arms and silver eyes." He returned to his quarters to record his final log entry as a Valorian officer, speaking words that would horrify his ancestors and inspire generations to come. "I spent my life avoiding danger because I believed survival was the purpose of existence." He recorded, "The humans taught me something different. Survival is not living, purpose is living. And true danger, the kind that burns away everything you think you know, is the only path to becoming who you were meant to be." He closed the log and stood by his viewport, listening to the sounds of the ship around him. Somewhere in the crew section, he heard human laughter echoing through the corridors, bright and loud and full of life. Keth Voren walked toward it, and he did not calculate the odds or plan his approach or consider what might happen next. He simply walked, one step at a time, toward the sound of people who had taught him that the best things in life are found on the other side of fear. And for the first time in 100 years, He felt truly alive.